There is a number that no one in Washington wants to say out loud. And when you hear it, you will understand why the most powerful trade negotiating apparatus on earth has been sitting in silence for 6 hours, staring at a press conference it cannot answer. That number is 54. We'll come back to it. Most coverage of the Canada-US trade war gives you the drama, the tariffs, the counter-tariffs, the summits that go nowhere, the statements that say nothing. What the coverage does not give you is the mechanism. The quiet, structural, irreversible thing that happened while everyone was watching the noise. Because if you understood the mechanism, you would understand that this is not a trade dispute anymore. It is a lesson in what happens when a coercive strategy meets a country that spent 7 years building the exit before the door was even threatened. What you are about to hear is not speculation. Every number in this analysis comes from American government sources. Not Canadian agencies, not international think tanks. The published taxpayer-funded data of the United States federal government, which is precisely what makes what happened so extraordinary. Let's build this from the ground up. For 3.5 decades after the original bilateral free trade agreement, the two countries constructed something economists had never seen between any two neighboring nations, a trading relationship so integrated, so mutually load-bearing, that it reached $760 billion in annual volume. To put that in perspective, that figure exceeded the combined GDP of most individual European nations. It's supported by the U.S. Department of Labor's own accounting. 391,000 American jobs, auto workers in Michigan, grain exporters in Kansas, lumber processors in Maine, dairy operations in Wisconsin. Real communities built on the assumption that the relationship was permanent, structural, and in everyone's interest to preserve. Then came the tariffs. Over 18 months, the United States imposed an average effective tariff rate of 26.3% on Canadian goods. The International Monetary Fund later classified this as the highest peacetime trade barrier erected between two treaty allies in the entire post-war period. The logic behind it was simple and on its surface reasonable. Canada was dependent. Its export economy ran through American ports, American highways, American consumers. 73% of everything Canada sold abroad went south. The assumption was that this dependency was so deep, so structural, so impossible to unwind in any meaningful time frame that Canada would have no realistic alternative to compliance, absorb the pain, return to the table, accept new terms. That assumption had one flaw. It was not built on current data. Here is what was actually happening while the tariff architects were drawing their maps. 7 years before the first tariff was imposed, Canada had quietly begun one of the most deliberate economic reorientation projects any G7 nation had attempted in the modern era. Not as a reaction to American pressure, as strategic foresight. Liquefied natural gas terminals on the Pacific coast, critical minerals frameworks with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and Australia, agricultural trade arrangements with Mexico, Britain, and the EU. None of it announced loudly, all of it advancing steadily, quarter by quarter, signing by signing, shipment by shipment. Think of it this way. Imagine you have a neighbor who controls the only road out of your neighborhood. For years, that road works fine. You use it every day. But quietly, without making a fuss about it, you spend 7 years building 3 new roads out of your own property. You don't tell the neighbor. You don't need to. You just build. Then one day, the neighbor puts up a toll booth and says, "Pay what I demand or you're trapped." And you look at him and you look at your 3 new roads and you say, "I appreciate the offer, but I'm good." That is structurally, mechanically what happened. By the time the tariff escalation reached its peak, those Pacific Coast LNG terminals that had been 7 years in development came online 11 months ahead of schedule. $22 billion in annual energy exports that had previously moved south now moved west and east to European buyers managing their own supply chain anxieties, to Asian markets hungry for stable, non-Chinese sourced energy. A critical minerals framework locked in forward purchase agreements for Canadian nickel, cobalt, lithium, and rare earth materials worth $51 billion over the coming decade. An agricultural reorientation absorbed the grain and canola volumes that American tariffs had displaced. stabilizing Canadian farm revenues even as American farm lobbyists filed emergency relief requests in Washington. The 73% export dependency that the tariff strategy had assumed was permanent. In 19 months, it fell to 54%, the fastest structural trade reorientation any G7 economy had accomplished since the end of the Second World War. Not a plan, a result, an accomplished fact. And then came the briefing document 72 hours before the press conference that would change the diplomatic calculus of the relationship. The White House distributed a formal trade briefing to allied governments, major financial institutions, and international media. The document asserted in plain language that Canada's diversification effort had failed to achieve meaningful scale, that Canada remained fundamentally dependent on American market access for its economic stability. The document cited 5 major statistics in support of this conclusion. 3 of those 5 statistics directly contradicted the published data of the United States Bureau of Economic Analysis, the United States Energy Information Administration, and the Congressional Budget Office, the American government's own institutions. The briefing stated, for example, that Canadian LNG exports to Europe had reached no more than $3 billion annually. The actual figure published 6 weeks earlier by the U.S. Energy Information Administration was $19.4 billion, more than 6 times higher. It described Canada's critical minerals position in global supply chains as negligible. The actual figures, confirmed by the OECD and Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, placed Canada as the 3rd largest non-Chinese source of battery-grade lithium and the 2nd largest source of aerospace-grade nickel for the European industrial complex. When that document reached Ottawa, the Prime Minister read it in full. He asked 2 questions. First, had the White House been provided with the correct data at any point in the preceding 18 months? The answer was yes, 7 times, through formal diplomatic channels, through the Bilateral Economic Working Group, through direct communications between the 2 countries' finance ministries. Second question, was there any indication this was an error rather than a deliberate misrepresentation? After a 3-minute review of the document's internal sourcing, the answer was no. He set the document down. He did not raise his voice. He said simply, then we answer it directly. 40 minutes later, he walked to a microphone and a journalist asked whether Canada still depended on American market access to sustain its economic growth. He did not hedge. He did not qualify. He delivered 5 words in the tone of someone stating an arithmetic result. We do not need America. Then for 7 minutes, he built the case, sentence by sentence, source by source. Every figure he cited came from an American government agency. The U.S. Energy Information Administration's numbers on LNG exports, the OECD's data on critical minerals, the Congressional Budget Office's own projections on American job losses from the tariff escalation, which showed the United States had absorbed 287,000 job losses in trade-exposed sectors since the tariff war began, compared to 94,000 in Canada. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's own data showing American grain exports to Canada had fallen 34% since the tariffs were imposed, while Canadian grain exports to the EU had risen 41% in the same period. He did not attack, he cited, he did not threaten, he reported. And then he said the 5 words again at the end almost as a footnote. The data that proves it, he noted, comes from America itself. The White House issued a response 6 hours later. It called the remarks unhelpful, counterproductive, and not in the spirit of the long-standing partnership between the 2 nations. It did not dispute a single number. The market moved within 3 hours of the press conference. The Canadian dollar strengthened 2.1% against the US dollar in a single session, the largest single-day bilateral currency movement in 11 years. The Toronto Stock Exchange rose 3.2%. American equities in trade-sensitive sectors declined sharply, automotive down 4.1%, agricultural inputs down 3.7%, industrial manufacturing down 2.9%. Goldman Sachs, in its client note that evening, attributed the S&P 500's 1.6% loss to what it described as the market's reassessment of the probability of a negotiated resolution under the current American trade posture. Institutional investors had concluded that the trade war was not going to end on American terms because American terms were no longer compelling. The Allied government response was immediate. The European Commission's Trade Commissioner issued a statement calling the remarks a factually grounded assessment that the Commission's own data fully supported. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry released a strategic assessment of North American supply chain risk that had been in preparation for 3 months and was timed, according to 2 senior Tokyo-based analysts, to coordinate with the press conference within hours. 3 European nations quietly converted informal critical minerals discussions with Canada into formal negotiations within 48 hours. 2 sovereign wealth funds, one in the Gulf region, one in Singapore, reduced American asset exposure by a combined $9 billion and increased Canadian exposure by $4.3 billion. The Financial Times described it as the most rapid institutional capital realignment between 2 neighboring economies since 2008. Inside the United States, the political damage was specific and geographic. The governor of Michigan held a press conference stating that his state's 78,000 workers with direct exposure to Canadian automotive supply chains needed a trade resolution, and that the press conference had made clear the current strategy had failed. He said simply that his workers were paying for a miscalculation every single day. A Republican senator from Kansas, whose state exports $3.2 billion in wheat and canola annually, said on the Senate floor that his administration had been given 7 separate opportunities to review corrected economic data and had chosen not to. His farmers deserved better. The National Association of Manufacturers called for a return to evidence-based trade policy making. The CEO of one of America's largest agricultural exporters told Reuters the company had begun supply chain reconfiguration planning that assumed the bilateral trade relationship would not normalize within the current political cycle, and that once implemented, the reconfiguration would take 3 to 4 years to reverse, even if a deal was reached. Here is the deeper logic of what happened and why it matters beyond the bilateral relationship. A tariff is a weapon of leverage. It works on a specific and narrow premise that the target has no alternative to compliance. The moment the target builds a real alternative, not an aspiration, not a negotiating position, an operational, revenue-generating, contract-backed alternative, the tariff stops being a weapon. It becomes a tax. You are collecting from your own consumers and businesses while the other side shops elsewhere. The weapon works only as long as the premise holds. Canada spent 19 months invalidating the premise, not as defiance, as arithmetic. What makes this moment structurally different from every previous declaration of economic independence in modern diplomatic history is that it was made backwards. The declaration came after the transformation, not before it. Most countries announce that they intend to diversify. They put out strategy documents, they hold summits, they make speeches. And then, years later, the results are mixed at best. What happened here was the opposite. The transformation happened first, quietly, operationally, contractually. The declaration was simply the public acknowledgement of something already complete. And that is why no one could argue with the 5 words. You cannot argue with a fact that has already occurred. The question that remains, and that will define the next chapter of this relationship, is the one that no one in the Allied diplomatic community has stopped asking since the press conference. Either the White House understood that its briefing documents misrepresented American government data and issued it anyway, in which case the problem is not a miscalculation but a choice, or it did not understand its own government's data, in which case the problem runs deeper than anyone in the Allied community had previously assessed. Both possibilities have the same consequence for every other government currently in negotiation with Washington. Both possibilities are why 47 foreign ministries, according to diplomatic sources who spoke to the Financial Times over the following 4 days, quietly updated their assessments of American negotiating reliability in the weeks that followed. And here is the number I kept for the end. Not 54, though that is the one that started us here. The number is 287,000. That is the count of American jobs lost in trade-exposed sectors since the tariff war began, according to the Congressional Budget Office's own projections. Not Canadian jobs, American ones. Workers in the states that the tariff strategy was designed to protect, in the industries it was designed to strengthen, in the communities it was designed to reassure. A strategy that set out to demonstrate American economic leverage ended by destroying American economic leverage. A strategy designed to keep Canada dependent accelerated the fastest diversification any G7 economy had achieved in a generation. A strategy built on numbers that contradicted the American government's own data was demolished in 7 minutes using only the American government's own data. The 21st century is not one with size, it is one with alternatives. The country that can walk away from the table holds the leverage. The country that cannot is simply paying a higher price to stay. We do not need America. 5 words, 19 months of work, a world that is still rearranging itself around the implications. The question for you is simpler and more personal. In the supply chains, the alliances, the trade corridors that are quietly being redrawn right now while the noise is happening somewhere else, where does your country stand? And does your government know the answer?